Goldie Cooper pushed the grocery cart, trying to calculate how much she would have to pay for its contents. "I hope I have enough money to pay for the groceries," the woman thought wistfully. But when the cashier gave her the total, Goldie realized that she was $10 short. The woman tried to fish out the rest of the change from her wallet, hoping that she would be able to scrape together the necessary amount. "Well, are you going to be done anytime soon? There's a line behind you," the cashier said impatiently. At that moment, Goldie realized that she definitely wouldn't have enough money to pay for everything. Looking at the groceries lying at the checkout, the woman tried to figure out what she could do without. Milk, maybe? Or cookies? But Patrick and Mary love them so much. Then there is salmonella, although I can't leave it. Sarah's crazy about it, and Bobby's always happy to eat it too, the woman was thinking. Fueled by the caustic comments of the cashier, people in line started getting annoyed. The situation was getting critical, and Goldie was about ready to leave all the groceries and run out of the supermarket empty-handed. But then something strange happened. An elderly man standing behind the unfortunate mother took out the necessary amount from his wallet and handed it to the astonished cashier. "Take it, ma'am. This should be enough," said the old man. The cashier got even more irritated, pursed her lips, and muttered, "You shouldn't pay for this scammer. People like her are used to living at someone else's expense. They're always waiting for an opportunity to trick some gullible fool out of their money." Her words made Goldie blush to the roots of her hair and quickly put the products into a bag. As she did it, she profusely thanked the old man for helping her out in a difficult situation. Moreover, the woman promised to pay him back every cent he spent on her. Bending under the weight of the grocery bag, Goldie hurried to the exit. But before the woman had gone far, the same stranger from the supermarket caught up with her. "Let me help you. You shouldn't have to carry such a heavy bag. Trust me, it's not a problem," the elderly man said. Goldie glanced at the stranger and carefully handed him her bag. Despite being sickly thin and pale, the man seemed quite respectable and didn't look suspicious at all. Moreover, he helped her pay for the groceries while other people in the line simply made snide comments and didn't even think about helping her. "I will definitely pay you back. I should get my benefits soon and I'll pay off all my debts," Goldie said, looking down in embarrassment. But the old man just shook his head and resolutely refused to talk about it again. As it turned out, the stranger's name was Ronald Hughes, and he was the owner of several companies in Northwest Chicago. Without even realizing it, Goldie shared her sad story with Ronald on their way to her house. The woman grew up in a poor family and learned the value of money early on in her life. Her mother worked as a postwoman, and her father died in an industrial accident. Time flew by, counting down days, months, and years. Despite her poverty, Goldie didn't lose heart and always hoped that her life would change one day. To the surprise of the young woman, her life did begin to change immediately after graduation. Like many young women her age, Goldie got married early. Her husband was a man named Kyle. From the moment they met, he surrounded Goldie with love and attention. Despite the protests of their parents, the young people held a small wedding ceremony and forever tied their lives together. Goldie and Kyle were happy together. They had 4 children who were all born 1 year apart and never ceased to amaze their parents with their successes. The oldest of the children was Patrick. Sarah and Bobby followed him, and little Mary was the youngest child. It was after the birth of his youngest daughter that the father of 4 decided to change his job and find a higher-paying position with better prospects. Kyle grew up in an orphanage and by the age of 28 had already mastered the profession of a construction worker. The family had enough money to live on, but Kyle dreamed of buying a big house in which each of his children would have their own room. For this very reason, he decided to take a job in New York, building a huge shopping mall. The salary he was promised by the contractor was 3 times higher than what Kyle was earning at his current job. This is my chance, isn't it? Where else could I earn that kind of money? It will only take us a year or two to save up enough to buy a new house, Kyle said happily. I know it's a good opportunity for you, dear, but for some reason, I'm feeling very anxious about it, Goldie said. Deep down, she was very unhappy about her husband's decision to work in a different city. Nevertheless, the woman didn't try to dissuade her husband or prevent him from trying to change their life for the better. Goldie loved her husband with all of her heart and was ready to follow him to the end of the world. Therefore, she meekly accepted Kyle's decision and agreed to wait for him as long as would be necessary. Unfortunately, about 2 months after her husband's departure, Goldie received the news of his death. The letter was dry and emotionless and stated that her husband had died in a car accident. According to the foreman, Kyle decided to take a trip home in order to spend Thanksgiving with his family. Trying to get home as soon as possible, the man decided to hitchhike. Unfortunately, about halfway home, the truck driver lost control of the vehicle, causing the truck to crash and fall into a river. Unlike the deceased trucker, the body of the young construction worker was never found. The rescuers said that the passenger had most likely died and that it was simply pointless to hope for his salvation. There was a strong current here, and the body could have been carried several hundreds of miles away from the crash site. The rescuers and divers kept repeating. Thus, by the will of fate, Goldie was left a widow with 4 children. Moreover, since Kyle's body was never found, the devastated woman had to bury an empty coffin in the city cemetery, having put some of her late husband's belongings inside. It all happened just 2 months ago, and Goldie hadn't been able to come to terms with the absence of her beloved husband and the father of her 4 children. Goldie shared the full story with Ronald Hughes in just one breath, not even attempting to hide her tears and sorrow. Upon hearing Goldie's story, the elderly businessman shook his head sympathetically and promised to help her. Thank you, sir. You have done so much for me already, the woman answered, brushing away a tear. No thanks needed, ma'am. I've lived a difficult life, so I understand what you're going through. My son died in a combat mission in one of the countries of the East. I always hoped to have grandchildren one day, and my wife, she survived our son by only 6 months, leaving me alone in this world. As you can see, the rich also cry, Mr. Hughes concluded. Now it was Goldie's turn to be surprised. For some reason, the woman never thought that young men from rich families could also serve in the Marine Corps, and not just go through training or a desk job, but protect the interest of their country thousands of miles away from their home. Well, here we are. Would you like to come inside for some tea? Goldie asked, stopping at the front door. Oh no, thank you very much. Maybe next time. I haven't been feeling well recently. The doctors keep talking about some kind of tumor and some surgery, but I keep putting it off, like a little boy afraid of going to the dentist. Ronald Hughes answered with a smile. Before leaving, the elderly man promised Goldie to look into the circumstances of her husband's death and get as much information about it as possible. To do that, the old man was going to hire a private detective who used to work in homicide up until his retirement. Of course, deep down, Goldie didn't really believe that a random man from the street could actually help her learn the truth about her husband, especially since it had already been 3 months since he went missing. A week went by in agonizing anticipation, and then another one. The woman didn't get any news from Ronald Hughes and had already decided that his promise was nothing but empty words. Then, one day, someone rang her doorbell several times. Wondering who it could be, Goldie opened the door and nearly fainted. There, right in front of her, stood Kyle. He was pale and thinner than he used to be, and he also had a scar on his forehead. Kyle, is that really you? Goldie exclaimed and rushed to hug her husband. Kyle, and it really was him, kissed his wife and pulled her in for a hug. Ronald Hughes was standing behind him. This reunion would have never happened without his help. A little later, when things calmed down a bit, Kyle told his wife that when he fell into the river, he hit his head on a rock and lost consciousness. The current picked up his body and carried him many miles away from the crash site. Fortunately, Kyle didn't die and was rescued by some local homeless people who were out on the river fishing. They brought Kyle to their shelter and gave him first aid. Unfortunately, having suffered a head injury, Kyle spent a month in delirium. And when he did come to his senses, he couldn't remember anything from his past. In order not to be a burden, the young man helped the homeless people in their hard line of work, spending about 2 months fishing with the rest of the group. Kyle had no money or documents on his person, and therefore he didn't even know his own name. Fortunately, the detective that Ronald Hughes had hired was rightfully considered one of the best in his field. It was only thanks to his professional instincts that Kyle was found and got to return home. But before he came back to his hometown, the man underwent a therapy course to treat his amnesia caused by the head injury he suffered when he fell into the river. And now, Kyle was surrounded by his 4 children, who were beyond happy to see their father again. "Thank you, Mr. Hughes," Goldie exclaimed with tears in her eyes. Just yesterday, the poor mother of 4 was considered a widow, and now her husband was back and very much alive. Ronald Hughes smiled and lowered his eyes in embarrassment. The old man was happy to help reunite the family. Left all alone, the elderly businessman quickly realized that all the wealth in the world was worth nothing if there was no one to share it with. Now that the life of Kyle and Goldie had returned back to normal, Mr. Hughes became the beloved grandfather for their 4 children, who always impatiently waited for his visits. Playing with Sarah, Patrick, Bobby, and Mary, the old man couldn't help but plunge into memories of the time when he was a young father and life seemed beautiful and unpredictable. Unfortunately, fate had its own plans for Ronald Hughes. The man died just 2 days before his 70th birthday. Few people knew that the old man had a feeling that he would die soon, and thus was in a hurry to do something good before he passed. 6 months after his death, a notary came to see Kyle and Goldie. He announced the last will of the late Mr. Hughes. According to the will, the young parents inherited all of his real estate and financial assets, as well as his many accounts in various banks around the world. Having a hard time believing that they were now incredibly rich, Kyle and Goldie couldn't hold back their tears. Now that the life of the young parents had changed completely, they couldn't help but admire the kindness of the late businessman. In memory of Ronald Hughes, Kyle and Goldie came to visit his grave every week, always bringing him a bouquet of roses. Moreover, the couple was confident that the late businessman was watching them from heaven and approved of all of their decisions.